There we go. We're back. Welcome back. So, to continue and finalize the presentation on Agile, we'll talk about user stories, story points, and planning, all of which were kind of mentioned in the previous lecture. So there's first we're going to go through 5 levels of planning. Then we'll dive into user stories and acceptance criteria. The user stories are important, and it's pretty common that people produce pretty weak user stories. So we'll look at that. Story points, what that is, and then that actually allows us to measure a team's velocity, a team's capacity. And then that in itself is used in order to estimate when will things be done. So, 5 levels of planning. So, from strategic to tactical. So, we can start at the bottom here, tactical. So, this is the daily scrums. You have a meeting, you're planning the day, only planning one day. One step up, you have the iteration plan, and this is the sprint planning meeting that you have with the product owner. So typically, you're going to have it once a week. Typically, it's like every second week. Then you have some form of a release plan, and this is typically done quarterly, about quarterly. Product roadmap and product vision. So these are mostly on the product side. So the product vision is about, what is this about? What are we trying to accomplish here? This is kind of similar to the initiation in a traditional way of doing things. And how is it going to benefit the business? Because at the end of the day, you know, at least it has been the case for quite a while now in this capitalistic society that we find ourselves in. The only reason a company does anything is in order to make money. There's no other reason. There hasn't been any other reason. This might start to change a little bit. I mean, we do have companies today that are actually, as part of their mission, is to improve things for humanity, right? But traditionally, it's only been for the sake of money, and this is something that. I mean, capitalism is not. It's a sidetrack again. Capitalism is not something that comes naturally. I mean, this is constructed. Like the whole consumerist society was designed. Right? We didn't used to have the ability to actually buy anything more or acquire anything more than what we needed. But after, I think it was after the Great Depression in the US, they needed to get the economy back up somehow. And how are they going to do that? That was kind of the birth of advertising and the birth of consumerism. It didn't exist before that. There's so many things we tend to forget because they are so ingrained in the society in which we live. So we don't really question them. Is this a natural law that we behave this way? And no, it's not. A lot of these things have actually been designed by somebody. It might not have been by mischief or by ill will, malicious or anything, but they had some other kind of objective in mind, and we are kind of now suffering some of the side effects of that and some of the good effects of that as well. But we sometimes it's good to kind of take a step back and ask yourself, is this the way things have to be? I mean, I've been thinking about sometimes, you know, the reasons babies cry when they pop out, right? Well, my guess is that, you know, the best time of their lives has just passed. And that's in the womb, where it's nice and warm, and you get food. You're just swimming around in this lukewarm existence, kind of. And then all of a sudden, boom! you're out, right? And it's just downhill from there, really. Because, I mean, once you get out, right, you're free, completely free. There's no ties at all, but it starts right away. Now we need to groom you somehow to become a functioning member of society. And there's a lot of things you need to learn in order to be part of society. But that's also not, it's not a natural law that you need to. What if you just left the baby, or, yeah, out in the jungle, right? I mean, what would happen? Chances are they would develop into something very different from what we are grooming them to become. Anyway, all right, Scrum. So the product roadmap, so one step down. So this is kind of high-level themes for the next few releases. There's a lot of wiggle room here. Next level is the release plan. And so here you go into kind of some more details when it comes to these high-level themes. Make sure everybody is on the same page, as the proverbial same page. Most of the time people are not even in the same book. Try to get some understanding what we'll be able to deliver, balance load between the teams. And this is just kind of a projection. You don't do this right away, the kind of a release plan. You wait a few iterations until you kind of get some idea what the capacity is. And then comes the iteration plan, and we already talked about that. That's the sprint planning meeting kind of results in the iteration plan. And this is important. You spend just every meeting in Scrum is time boxed. Right? So with the understanding that you won't be able to understand everything after the meeting. But the idea is that avoid analysis paralysis, right? Avoid spending too much time trying to design things unless you have to do it, right? Because once you get into them, it's going to be different anyway. So spend just enough time so that you understand enough so that you can get on with your work. That's the idea. And then we have the daily planning meeting, which is the daily Scrum meeting. Those are the 5 levels of planning. So here's another kind of product backlog. And so on the top of the product backlog, you have the highest priority stories, and it says at the bottom here, must be updated prior to every sprint planning meeting. And stuff further down on the backlog, these stories can be big. They typically call them epics, right? Because if you're not going to address those right now, what's the point trying to break them down into? Because it might be that this epic never becomes important enough because there's new stuff coming in all the time that you want to do beforehand. So any time you spend trying to better understand something that will never get done, is just wasted time. While the stories at the top that are ready to be picked by the team, those they need to be pretty fine-grained. You need to have a very good understanding as the product owner of what it means. So the further down you go in this backlog, the more granular the stories become. So why are we using user stories? Well, because requirements is really a communication problem. Right? You're communicating something from those who want it to those who are going to do it for you. And, well, this is a pretty typical story, actually. This is not what I wanted. Who told you that these are our requirements? Well, sir, you did. Really? I said these words? These were our requirements? Well, then, whoever was taking notes was not hearing me correctly. Right? So to communicate what you want done is extremely important, to be able to do that. And here you have this one again, which you've seen before. So, a user story. So, you've used user stories before, right?
A little bit.
A little bit, but you haven't been like anal about what they should look like. So a user story is a brief description of functionality told from the perspective of a user. And they all look like this. As who, I want what, so that why. To contrast that with use cases, which is a more traditional way of communicating requirements, a use case is a series of interactions between a system and one or more actors. You familiar with use cases? Yeah, okay. So I don't need to spend time on that. I can contrast them to each other though. So user stories are about needs and use cases are about behavior of a system. User stories are faster to produce and can be written by product folks. Use cases it's difficult for product folks to write them. User stories are used for planning and estimation. They're not a sequence of actions. They contain acceptance criteria. They're not documenting every aspect, and we'll get to that. And they can be coded and tested in one sprint. Or rather, a good user story can be coded and tested in one sprint. So a good user story, that's this acronym, there's always acronyms around, should be independent, so the minimum number of dependencies. It should be negotiable, so details to the story can be added through collaboration between the team and the product owner. It should provide some value for the customer. It should be estimable. It should be reasonably small, so it can be done in a week, and it should be testable. We should have acceptance criteria. A couple of good user stories. So this is a video sharing site. As a creator, I want to upload a video from my local machine so that any user can view it. Clear in a way, right? I mean, of course there are details needed, right? How big is this file allowed to be, for example? So there's details needed. So all those details are not captured in the user story itself. Or as a user, I want to search by keyword to find videos that are relevant to me. So it's clear who I am, it's clear what I want, and it's clear why I want it. Those three pieces always need to be there. So a user story, there's like really three pieces to it in a way. The three C's. It's the story itself, and you could write this on a card if you want to. We're not going to use cards, because we're going to use kind of digital artifacts here. There's a conversation around this story. So there's a story on the backlog, on the product backlog. When the product owner kind of presents that to you, the team typically has questions. Right? Well, what about this case? What about these edge cases? How do you want us to deal with these edge cases? This is part of a conversation that happens, and this conversation should be captured somehow because these are kind of sub-detailed requirements about the user story. And then some form of acceptance criteria that helps the team understand when it's done. What is okay here? When will the product owner be satisfied? And acceptance criteria should also be expressed in the same kind of language as the user story itself. So an example here. So the story says, as a creator, I want to upload a video from my local machine so that any user can view it. Now, from the conversation between the team and the product owner, we learned that the upload button should be present on every page of the site. Videos must not be larger than 100 megabytes or longer than 10 minutes. We need to support the following file formats, and we need to show a real-time progress indicator while it's being uploaded. Confirmation here would be, so this is essentially a test case. click the upload button, specify a video file to be uploaded, make sure that these extensions or these formats are supported, make sure that no other formats are supported. So these are expressed in a language that everybody understands, right? Check the size, check that you cannot upload too long movies, then you click the upload video and you check that the progress is displayed in real time. So this is what a product owner says. If this is true, then I say, okay, this is good. Some bad user stories. As a user, I want to be able to manage ads so that I can remove expired and erroneous ads. Any idea why that's bad?
Then any user can do.
Yeah, who is the user? Right? Is the user if the user wants to be able to manage ads, they're probably working for an advertiser. Is it the CEO of this advertiser? Because the CEO of the advertiser, you know, they only want the dashboard with blinking lights and stuff, only colors, right? Because that's all they understand. They don't have time to read anything, right? Or is this somebody working in ad operations, right? Some lower level person in the organization? That's important to know here. As a developer, I want to improve error logging. Well, you know, we all understand what it means, but it's not strictly a good user story because there's no why here, right? It says who, it says what, but it doesn't really say why. So why do you want to do this? Probably in order to be able to address problems that customers are facing. Right? But then write that so we know why. As a product owner, I want this product to kick ass, and it's pretty obvious that that's a poor user story. It's certainly not implementable in one sprint, right? That's for sure. Or all connections to the database go through a connection pool. Yeah, we as technologists kind of understand what that means, but why do you want to do this? Well, probably in order to conserve resources on the server side, which means that you can provide a better service to your users of this system. Sometimes it's hard though. Sometimes you feel like, you know, I know what I want done. Do I really need to kind of shoehorn this into the format of a user story? So sometimes it gets a little bit uncomfortable that way. So there's cheating happening every now and then. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to keep our eyes on the ball, right? We should know what is the right thing to do. Acceptance criteria example. As a conference attendee, I want to register online so it's fast and I can cut down on paperwork. Acceptance criteria here, a user cannot submit the form without completing all mandatory fields. Information actually needs to be persisted in the database. Credit card payment should be supported. An acknowledgement email needs to be sent. You see, these things, especially the bottom two acceptance criteria here, they are not that obvious when you look at the user story. So it's not, you cannot capture all. If you try to capture all of that in a user story, it becomes too unwieldy somehow. You know, you won't really, you're missing kind of the forest for all the trees kind of thing. Another example, acceptance criteria. As a user of the library catalog, I want advanced search options on the front page so that I can quickly and easily refine my search. And so here it specifies what you can do, and even I can filter by availability, for example. That's not captured in the user story, but that's something that the product owner says. Of course, that's kind of, that's the main reason for this story, that I can filter by availability. So that comes up in the conversation. It's also important to have these, what they call personas. Have you worked with personas? No? These are kind of different types of users of a system. And because different users can have very different needs. It could be based on how often they use the system. It could be based on their level of expertise within the domain, like say in advertising, for example. How kind of what their digital competencies are, or whether they are new or not. I mean, try to design something that works well both for newbies and power users. It's very, very difficult. Right? Power users, they just want command line. Right? Newbies, they don't even know what command line is. Right? So how are you going to satisfy both these with one product, with one piece of functionality? It's not obvious at all. See here we have an example, and this is very common these days. You create these personas, right? And then you keep those guys in mind. You have a number of personas, and typically you have them on the walls. And you keep those guys in mind. So how would Paul deal with this? Well, you know, since he smokes hand-rolled cigarettes, you know, chances are, you know, that he goes out to smoke every now and then, and we don't want to cancel his session because he might be in the midst of some workflow process, and so we cannot expect that he finishes this right away, but he might go out for a smoke before moving on in the workflow. So we cannot cancel his session too quickly. We need to leave that alive for an hour or a few hours or whatever it is, right? So these kind of little things about these personas might make you realize that we need to design things a little bit differently. So story points, finally. Forget about the business value column there. We're not going to talk about that. So story point is the number of story points associated with a story is some form, represents the estimated effort. Not hours, effort. Right? Well, you know, how do you measure effort? Well, you don't need to. Right? And I'll show you why. But so this says that the second user story here, for example, the team assesses that the second user story takes about twice as much effort by the team as the first user story. It doesn't say anything about how many hours it's going to take. It only says it takes about twice as much effort as the first one. And since we don't know the hours for the first one either, so, you know, how does this help? Well, it will. So here's how you do it. So you have a number of stories on a product backlog, and you pick one of them. Actually, how about this? You have one iteration. That's probably what we're going to do. You have one iteration. We run one sprint. And then, at the second sprint planning meeting, we look at the stories that we pulled off in the first sprint. We take the one that required a medium amount of time out of those stories that we pulled off. And we say, let's call that a 5. Now, you go through the product backlog and look at those stories, and you estimate each one of them relative to the one you gave a 5. So it's relative. It's no absolute at all. So, but you ask yourself, is it about half? Is it about the same? Is it about half as the 5 story? Or maybe it's twice as difficult as the 5 story. In that case, he gets 10 points instead. And we're using, for various reasons here, we're using Fibonacci numbers, except for this one should be 21, but it is 20 still. Yeah. So why story points instead of time? Well, time estimates tend to vary by person a lot, and they encourage padding. Right? If somebody's going to ask you, how long is this going to take you? You're gonna add a little buffer there to make sure that you can actually deliver. You know, and we don't want buffers. We want kind of honest assessments. And it turns out that story points efforts are more consistent from person to person than what time estimates are. And it's not a commitment to any time at all. And it's way easier to estimate relative size rather than absolute size of something. So the way you get to the story points is by playing planning poker. So each player gets cards with those values, with the Fibonacci numbers. The team discusses the user story to make sure that everybody understands what needs to be done. And then all players give their estimates showing cards simultaneously. Right? Now, so say that you get 3, 3, 3, 5, and 7 here. Now you ask the outliers here to explain themselves. Why do you think this is a 7? I would ask this guy. Ask C here. Why do you think this is a 7? And this guy might say, well, you know, I know we need to do those things, but there's also a lot of database work. We need to actually restructure the database in order to do this. And it might be that none of the other guys thought of that because this is the database expert on the team. Right? They didn't know that when they made their assessment about the sizing this story. So after the outliers have explained themselves, it goes into another round of voting until there's some form of consensus on the team. Right? And why do we play planning poker? Because we get multiple expert opinions about things. No individual could have come to as good of an assessment as the collective does here, because people are experts on different things. The dialogue results in accurate estimates. And yeah, studies show that this is actually a better value than you would get individually. And on top of that, it's kind of fun to do it, you know. And it could also be sometimes that you have an outlier who says, oh, this story is a 2, but the rest of the team says it's a 5. Because this guy who says it's a 2, knows that, you know what, I saw this package the other day, so we can just use that off the shelf. You know, this is trivial. He was the only guy who knew, right? And when the other guys hear that in the next round, yeah, they tend to lower their estimates as well. So design by committee is typically bad, but this kind of assessment by committee is a good thing. So what are we going to use these story points for? Well, the velocity is the number of story points that a team, to aggregate the story points that are being done in one sprint by the team. Right? That's the velocity of the team. Right? So if you do pull off 12 story points in one sprint, then your velocity is 12. If you pull off, 9 in the next sprint, it might be that you adjust your velocity. Maybe it's 10 instead of 12. Right? And this varies drastically between teams because, remember, the story points are relative. So one team might call the same story, for the same story, one team might call it a 5 and the other team might call it a 13. So you cannot compare between teams at all. But after a number of sprints within one team, you're going to start to see a pattern. Right? The team is going to, the number of points that they pull off in each iteration is going to increase because the team becomes better. But it would also kind of stabilize. It will converge towards something. And that value is your velocity. Now, let's see how we make use of these story points. in both sprint planning and release planning. So say that your velocity is 9 story points, and this is your product backlog. Well, then chances are you will only be able to pull off the first 3 stories, because together they are 8. If your capacity, velocity is truly 9, you won't be able to do 12. You will fail. Right? So it's a way for the team to gauge how much they should commit to. Okay, so that's fine for the sprints themselves, but this is very common. You know, the product owner asks you, how much will be done by June 30th? When can we ship this set of features? And your tools that you have to answer that question from the product owner is your velocity and a prioritized backlog. And it's pretty simple. The duration of how much time it would take for you to pull off everything on the product backlog, you just aggregate the story points to the product backlog, you divide that by the velocity, which is how many you can do, the team can do in each iteration, and there you go. That's how many iterations are required in order to do all of that. I don't know how many times in the past I've been in kind of traditional organizations been asked, you know, how long is it going to take to test this set of features? And the testing is going to happen in April of next year. And you kind of just pulling the answer out of you know where, you know. Here at least you have some, I'm not saying that this is perfect at all, right? But at least you have something to back up your assessment with. So if our velocity is 9 points and the product manager wants to release after 2 iterations, we can tell the product owner that we can do these stories, the first 2 sets of stories there. And then the next would have to go into the next release. Or you might kind of give them a little bit of wiggle room in a way, because you have a worst case scenario and you have a best case scenario. So in this case, if your velocity is 9, the best case scenario would be that you would essentially be able to release everything, almost everything, after three more iterations. And the worst case scenario says that you're going to need 5 more iterations in order to release all of that product backlog. So this is information you can give to the product owner. They can do whatever they want with that information. Or if they want to communicate that to the marketing department, that's their problem. It's not our problem. We're only providing them with the information. They are taking action. Wow. Done. So, to summarize. Whoa. Talking too fast. Maybe because I stayed on topic. For a change. Okay, it's great to be alive. It really is. It's the best thing, you know. Yeah, to summarize, so we looked at 5 different levels of planning, the vision, the product roadmap, release planning, iteration planning, and daily planning. We looked at what user stories are and acceptance criteria, and a good user story was needs to satisfy this INVEST, which is independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. It's the first time I remember all of them. And then we talked about the 3 C's, which was the card, the conversation, and the acceptance criteria, right? Card, conversation, wasn't it? I think it was. So the user story is not exhaustive, right? It just explains it in terms of end user value, what you want done. And of course, there are lots of details in order to fully understand how to implement it, but that's captured then in a conversation with the product owner. But don't pollute the user story with too much details, right? It's better to keep that elsewhere. User story should be succinct. And story points, which are relative, and the main motivation for story points is really for planning. Yeah. And so you use the story points for estimating, and you use the story points to estimate the team velocity, and then you can use the team velocity together with story points to decide to figure out how soon we can ship things. That's it. So this is the last lecture in this course. So not that many lectures, but this is not what the course is about, right? So next week on Wednesday, I think, I will be here again together with Lasse to run the first sprint planning meeting, because I have much more experience with this than what he has to kind of get us off on a right trajectory. And before that, you will be divided into teams. I don't know exactly how that is going to work. We spoke with Jakob. He said we might try to reuse teams that are also in this continuous delivery course or whatever it is that's going on right now. But it will also depend on your strengths and weaknesses. We're not going to ask about those. We're only going to ask about your strength, so that we get a decent composition of the teams, because the teams are supposed to be cross-functional, so we don't get kind of back-end experts on one team and UI designers on another team. So we actually mix things up, because that's how it's done out there in that reality. Still part of the same illusion. But here we are, so we might as well, enjoy the illusion. Play while you're here. It's a gift. Any questions? So there will be some prompt by Lasse for you guys to fill out what your strengths are, so that we can do this team division. Anything else? Then I will be able to catch an earlier train, which is great, actually. So thank you. I'll see you on Wednesday.